The Forgotten Horror of 1945. History often remembers wars in terms of battles won and lost, generals, treaties, and the shifting borders of nations. Yet hidden beneath those grand narratives are the unspoken tragedies that scar humanity forever. When the Second World War reached its climax in 1945, Germany was a nation on its knees. Hitler's Reich had collapsed, cities lay in rubble, millions were displaced, and civilians braced themselves for the approaching armies. For Germans, especially women, the end of the war did not bring relief. It brought a new nightmare. As the Soviet Red Army advanced from the east, an epidemic of violence swept across towns and villages. Historians now estimate that between 1.4 to 2 million German women were victims of atrocities, ranging from brutal assaults to long-term trauma that would haunt generations. This was not a few isolated cases. It was systematic, massive, and often carried out with the silent tolerance of military leadership. In Berlin alone, more than 100,000 women were assaulted in just a few weeks, according to hospital records. Girls as young as 12 and women in their 70s were not spared. Yet for decades, this story was silenced. Victims were shamed, society ignored them, and history books focused on other narratives of the war. But the truth remains one of the darkest, most disturbing legacies of the Second World War, a legacy that is still difficult for the world to face. This is not just a story of numbers. It is the story of broken lives, of whispered secrets carried for decades, and of humanity at its lowest. Now, let us step into the ruins of Germany in 1945 and uncover what really happened when the Soviet army entered the heart of Europe. The fall of the Third Reich. The winter of 1945 was unlike any Germany had ever known. Bombing raids had reduced once proud cities into skeletons of brick and ash. Hunger gnawed at civilians daily. Bread was scarce, clean water was limited, and families often scavenged from ruins just to survive. The propaganda of Joseph Goebbels could no longer convince the people of imminent victory. The Reich was collapsing, and everyone knew it. As the Red Army pushed westward, its arrival was preceded by rumors. Refugees fleeing from the east carried stories. Soldiers storming villages, plundering homes, taking revenge on civilians, especially women. Some in Germany dismissed these accounts as exaggerations. Others, terrified, believed every word. Mothers whispered warnings to their daughters. Fathers tried desperately to find safe hiding places. In Berlin, Hitler remained in his underground bunker, detached from reality, promising impossible counterattacks. But for the ordinary people, the war had already reached their doorsteps. By January 1945, the Soviets had entered East Prussia. Civilians were trapped between the retreating German forces and the advancing Red Army. Families tried to escape westward in carts, on bicycles, and even on foot. The roads were clogged with desperate people, carrying what little they could. Winter winds cut through their thin clothing. Many froze before reaching safety. Those who stayed behind faced the fate they feared most. Soldiers, drunk with power and rage, took over homes, barns, and basements. They claimed food and drink. And then, one by one, they began claiming women. The first encounters. The earliest reports were chaotic. In small villages, soldiers barged into homes, demanding alcohol or valuables. If resisted, the punishment was swift. Men were beaten or shot, and women dragged away. Survivors later described hearing the cries of their neighbors through the thin walls of wooden houses. Some tried to hide under floorboards, in cellars, or even in haylofts, but soldiers searched every corner. One survivor, later interviewed by historians, recalled, "We had heard the stories, but when it came to us, we still could not believe it. My mother tried to shield me, but they dragged her away. She was 43. I was 16. Neither of us was spared." Another chilling account came from a nun in East Prussia. The convent where she lived became a target, and even women in religious robes were not exempt. "They saw only women," she said. "Not their vows, not their prayers, only their bodies." A wave of fear. Word spread quickly. Families devised desperate strategies. Some mothers smeared soot on their daughters' faces, trying to make them look older and less attractive. Others cut off their hair or dressed them in oversized men's clothing, but no disguise could guarantee safety. As the Soviets moved deeper into Germany, the violence escalated. Hospitals filled with women who were not only physically injured but also traumatized beyond words. Many doctors, overwhelmed by the numbers, simply recorded exhaustion or injury rather than the true nature of their suffering. It wasn't just young women. Reports documented that grandmothers, pregnant women, and even children became victims. Soldiers often laughed, boasting that this was revenge for what the Germans had done in their homeland. For them, it was not just violence, it was punishment. The collapse of morality. In the crumbling world of 1945, the line between soldier and criminal blurred. Commanders sometimes ignored what was happening, sometimes even encouraged it. The chaos of war provided cover for atrocities on a massive scale. One Soviet general, after hearing of the widespread assaults, was said to have remarked coldly, "Our men deserve some fun after fighting so hard." For the victims, there was no justice, no recourse, no safety. The war had stripped them of everything: homes, families, and now dignity. Berlin awaits. By March 1945, the Red Army was closing in on Berlin itself. The capital, already battered by Allied bombings, was preparing for its final siege. Inside homes and shelters, women whispered their fears to one another. Some carried small bottles of poison, determined to take their own lives rather than face what they had heard. The city braced itself. In the minds of Berliners, there was no doubt what was coming, and when April arrived, their worst nightmares turned into reality: the first wave of violence in Berlin. The spring of 1945 was unlike any spring Berliners had ever known. Normally, cherry blossoms and warmer air would have brought life back into the battered capital. But this year, April came with only fear. The thunder of artillery shook the ground day and night. Families huddled in cellars, not only to escape the bombs but to hide from what was coming. The Soviet Red Army was at the gates. For months, Berliners had heard the stories of what happened in East Prussia, Pomerania, and Silesia. Women assaulted, families destroyed, villages burned. Now those rumors were no longer distant whispers. They were a countdown to the city's fate. The siege begins. By April 16, 1945, the Soviets launched their final offensive against Berlin. Over 2.5 million Red Army soldiers moved in with overwhelming force. The city was surrounded, its defenses collapsing. Civilians could hear the gunfire grow louder each day, knowing it was only a matter of time before the soldiers reached their neighborhoods. Inside the city, people prepared in desperation. Some families built makeshift hiding spaces under floorboards or inside walls. Others packed bundles of clothes and food, planning to run at the first chance. Mothers clutched their daughters and whispered prayers. Some women, remembering the fate of others in the East, swallowed poison or handed it to their children, deciding that death would be better than capture. The streets were eerily empty. What few men remained were either too old, too young, or wounded from previous battles. Women now outnumbered men dramatically, making them the primary targets once the soldiers broke through. The first Red Army units enter. On April 21, the first Soviet units entered the northeastern districts of Berlin. They came not as cautious liberators, but as victors hungry for revenge. Many were hardened by years of brutal fighting, having seen villages in their homeland destroyed by German forces. For them, Germany was the enemy, and its people were the price of war. That very night, the first reports of violence came from the outer districts. In Weissensee and Lichtenberg, women were dragged from their homes. Soldiers demanded alcohol, money, and watches. Once they took what they wanted, they turned on the women. Neighbors listened helplessly to screams echoing through basements. A nurse who later recorded her experiences in a diary wrote, "The soldiers came in groups. They did not ask. They did not wait. They took. Girls, mothers, grandmothers, no one was spared. We were powerless. We prayed they would leave quickly, but they returned again and again." The flood of atrocities. As Soviet troops pushed deeper into Berlin, the violence became widespread. Hospitals filled with women seeking medical help. Doctors reported treating victims ranging in age from 12 to 70. Many were so injured they could barely walk. The statistics recorded after the war are staggering. In just the first few weeks of Soviet occupation, at least 100,000 women in Berlin were assaulted. Some historians believe the true number was much higher, perhaps double, as countless victims never reported their suffering out of shame or fear. What shocked survivors most was the relentlessness of it. Soldiers came not just once but repeatedly. Women hid during the day only to be dragged out at night. In some cases, entire groups of soldiers would take turns on a single victim. Stories from the shadows. One of the most haunting testimonies came from Marta Hillers, a young journalist who kept a diary of her experiences. She described how women tried to negotiate with Soviet officers, offering themselves to one man in hopes of avoiding being taken by many. It was a desperate survival strategy, an attempt to limit suffering by sacrificing dignity. Another survivor recalled her grandmother, 72 years old, being assaulted in front of the family. "We cried and begged, but they only laughed," she said. "When it was over, my grandmother was silent. She never spoke again until she died." Even nuns and religious women were not spared. Churches, once considered sanctuaries, were stormed by soldiers. Sacred spaces were desecrated, filled with violence and cries for mercy. The psychological toll. The trauma spread like an invisible plague. Women who had survived the bombings and hunger now found themselves broken in ways they could not even speak about. Many became suicidal. In some neighborhoods, groups of women hanged themselves together rather than endure another night. Others drowned themselves in canals or jumped from ruined buildings. The city morgues filled not only with victims of shelling, but with women who chose death over violation. The silence of men. What few German men were present, elderly fathers, brothers, or wounded soldiers, often could not protect their families. They were beaten, shot, or forced to watch helplessly. For many, this humiliation was as devastating as the act itself. One man later admitted, "I felt less than human. I could not stop them. They laughed at me as they dragged my wife away. I wanted to die." This silence and helplessness created an unspoken wound in German families that lasted for decades. Fathers and sons carried guilt for not protecting their mothers and sisters, even though they had no power to resist. A city in terror. By late April, Berlin was a city of shadows. Women no longer walked the streets alone. Families locked themselves in cellars for days, rationing scraps of food and whispering in the dark. At night, gunfire mixed with the sounds of boots kicking down doors. There was no law, no authority, no safety. The city had collapsed into chaos. For the people of Berlin, the Red Army had not come as liberators. They had come as conquerors, and their conquest was written not in victory parades, but in the suffering of thousands of innocents. The days ahead. The nightmare had only just begun. In May 1945, when Germany finally surrendered, Berliners hoped the violence would end. But the occupation would last for years, and for many women, the assaults continued long after the official end of the war. And as Berlin burned and broke in other parts of Germany, East Prussia, Silesia, and beyond, the same horrors were unfolding on an even larger scale: mass atrocities across Germany, beyond Berlin. When the Red Army swept into Germany in early 1945, the brutality that shocked Berlin was not an isolated tragedy. It was only the most visible part of a vast wave of violence that engulfed the eastern provinces. Between January and May of 1945, entire regions of Germany became battlefields, and for the civilians, especially women, there was no escape. Reports from East Prussia, Pomerania, and Silesia describe a scale of assault so immense that some historians call it the largest incident of mass rape in recorded history. East Prussia, the first target. East Prussia was the first German territory to fall under Soviet invasion. As Soviet forces stormed across the border in January 1945, towns like Nemmersdorf became infamous for the atrocities committed there. Nemmersdorf was one of the first German villages taken by the Red Army in October 1944. When German troops briefly retook it, they discovered scenes of unspeakable horror. Women nailed to barn doors after being assaulted. Families slaughtered in their own homes. Elderly villagers shot or beaten to death. The Nazis quickly used Nemmersdorf for propaganda, publishing photos to terrify the German public about what awaited them if they lost the war. While some of these images were staged, there is no doubt that the Red Army committed mass atrocities there, just the beginning of what would spread across the entire province. By early 1945, as Soviet troops pressed deeper, civilians fled in massive columns. Women pushed carts, carried children, and begged for space on overcrowded wagons. Yet escape was nearly impossible. Soviet tanks caught the refugees on frozen roads, crushing carts under their treads. Those who survived bombardments often fell into soldiers' hands, where their fate was sealed. Pomerania, a corridor of violence. Farther west, Pomerania became another corridor of terror. As villages fell, Soviet soldiers moved house to house, looting and assaulting. Witnesses recalled soldiers drunk on stolen liquor, moving in packs, dragging women from cellars. One survivor, a girl of 14, later told how she and her mother were taken together. "They laughed while we cried," she said. "When they were done, they pushed us outside into the snow." Even children were not spared. Reports documented assaults on girls as young as 8 and elderly women in their 70s. Doctors in local hospitals noted that they were overwhelmed by victims seeking treatment for injuries and venereal disease. Some hospitals lacked medicine. They could offer only silence and a bed. Silesia, a province shattered. Silesia, with its large cities like Breslau, now Wrocław, Poland, became another center of devastation. As the Red Army fought its way into the province, thousands of women were targeted. Hospitals reported epidemic levels of venereal disease among both civilians and soldiers, evidence of the scale of assault. In one small Silesian town, records later showed that almost every woman between the ages of 12 and 50 had been attacked. Many were assaulted repeatedly over weeks. Survivors described entire groups of soldiers breaking into houses, sometimes assaulting mothers and daughters in front of husbands and fathers. The violence was not just sexual, it was brutal, often fatal. Victims were beaten, mutilated, or shot afterward. For many, the assault was a death sentence, whether from injuries, infections, or the psychological collapse that followed. Numbers too large to comprehend. The statistics are staggering. Historians estimate that in East Prussia, Pomerania, and Silesia alone, more than 1.4 million German women were assaulted during this period. And these numbers only represent the cases historians could piece together from hospital records, testimonies, and survivor accounts. The true number will never be known. Many victims never came forward. Shame, silence, and the destruction of records erased countless stories. In Berlin alone, around 100,000 cases were reported. Across Germany, scholars estimate that between 1.9 and 2 million women suffered sexual violence at the hands of the Red Army. The atmosphere of revenge. To understand why this violence spread so widely, one must consider the mindset of the Red Army soldiers. For years, They had endured Nazi atrocities on Soviet soil. Villages burned, women assaulted, civilians massacred. Entire families were wiped out by German forces. Soviet propaganda fueled their rage, portraying Germans not as individuals but as a collective enemy to be punished. Commanders often turned a blind eye, focusing on military objectives rather than the suffering of civilians. In some cases, officers even encouraged vengeance. One Soviet general chillingly remarked, "We lecture our soldiers too much about politics and too little about how to treat a woman. The result is mass rape." Not all Soviet soldiers participated. Some tried to protect civilians, hiding families or shooting looters. But the sheer size of the Red Army and the chaos of war meant that those who sought revenge often outnumbered those who showed mercy. The collapse of German society. The assaults tore apart German communities in ways that cannot be measured only in numbers. Families disintegrated under the weight of trauma. Women carried lifelong shame, often hiding their suffering even from loved ones. Men carried guilt for failing to protect their families, even when they had no power to stop the violence. Children born of assault, sometimes called children of the occupation, were stigmatized, growing up in silence about their origins. In villages, whispers replaced conversation. Women who survived rarely spoke, fearing judgment or rejection. Some turned to suicide. Others numbed themselves in silence, raising families while carrying secret wounds. A nation of survivors. What is remarkable is how many women, despite such horror, went on to rebuild their lives. After 1945, Germany lay in ruins, not only its cities but its spirit. Yet survivors became the backbone of reconstruction. Mothers who had endured unimaginable nights raised children, worked in fields, and cleared rubble from bombed streets. They did not speak of what had happened, but their resilience carried Germany into a new era. The silence lasted decades. Only in recent years have survivors' voices been recorded in books and documentaries. Their testimonies reveal a pain long hidden but never forgotten. Shadows of memory. The atrocities committed by the Red Army remain one of the darkest chapters of World War II. For many years, the subject was taboo, ignored by both East and West Germany. In East Germany, under Soviet control, it was forbidden to speak of Soviet crimes. In West Germany, the focus remained on Nazi atrocities, leaving little space to discuss German suffering. But the silence did not erase memory. In every town, in every family, the scars remained, the end of the war and the silent aftermath. Germany on its knees. By May 1945, Germany was finished. The Third Reich, which had promised 1,000 years of glory, collapsed after only 12. Hitler was dead, cities lay in ruins, and millions of civilians wandered as refugees across the countryside. But even as the official war drew to a close for women in Germany, the nightmare was not yet over. The violence of the Red Army continued through the days of surrender. Soldiers still moved through villages and cities, looting, drinking, and assaulting. For many women, May 8th, the day celebrated across Europe as Victory in Europe Day, was just another day of survival. The culture of silence. The mass assaults had left deep wounds, but in the conservative, patriarchal culture of post-war Germany, survivors faced another form of suffering: silence. Talking openly was considered shameful. Women feared being judged as dishonored. Husbands, fathers, and brothers often reacted with anger, not compassion. Many men saw the assaults not only as an attack on the women, but on their own masculinity. Some distanced themselves from their wives or partners. A small but painful number of marriages broke under the strain. This silence was enforced by necessity. Families were busy trying to survive amid food shortages, homelessness, and disease. There was little emotional space to confront trauma, so the subject was buried, within families, within towns, and eventually within national memory. The scale of suicide. The psychological toll was so crushing that thousands of women and men chose suicide. In Berlin alone, hospitals recorded an extraordinary spike in suicides during and after April 1945. Some women ended their lives immediately after an assault, unable to bear the shame. Others killed themselves later, when pregnancies or illnesses became unbearable reminders. Entire families sometimes committed suicide together. Mothers poisoned children, unwilling to see them grow up in the ruins of a defeated nation. Fathers shot themselves after witnessing the violation of their wives or daughters. The suicide wave became one of the least discussed tragedies of 1945. Survivors often buried their dead quietly, with no public acknowledgement of why they had chosen death. The medical crisis. Hospitals overflowed with survivors. Doctors recorded overwhelming cases of sexual injuries. Many women suffered internal damage that left them unable to bear children. Venereal diseases, especially syphilis and gonorrhea, which spread rapidly. Pregnancies. Thousands of women conceived children as a result of assault. Abortions were technically illegal in Nazi Germany and remained highly restricted afterward. But in practice, doctors often turned a blind eye, quietly assisting women who begged for help. Some hospitals became centers of whispered desperation, with lines of women seeking a solution. Yet not all pregnancies were terminated. Thousands of children were born to mothers who had no choice but to raise them. Some were abandoned in orphanages. Others were kept but grew up with a heavy silence around their father's identity. The women of the rubble. In the years immediately following the war, women took on a new role in German society. With so many men dead, imprisoned, or missing, women became the main force in rebuilding. They were called Trümmerfrauen, or women of the rubble. Photographs show them clearing bombed-out streets, carrying bricks in buckets, and reconstructing cities brick by brick. But behind those iconic images lay another truth. Many of these women were also survivors of assault. Their labor, their silence, and their endurance became the foundation on which a shattered nation was rebuilt. Memory suppressed. For decades, the subject remained taboo. In East Germany, GDR, speaking of Soviet crimes was forbidden. The Soviet Union was portrayed as a heroic liberator, and women's suffering had no place in official history. Survivors learned to stay silent or risk persecution. In West Germany, FRG, discussion of civilian suffering was overshadowed by the enormity of Nazi crimes. Talking about German victims was often seen as an attempt to downplay German guilt. So for nearly half a century, the story of these women remained hidden. Families knew, whispers circulated, but public acknowledgement was absent. A glimpse of resistance. Not every soldier participated in the violence, and not every woman was left defenseless. Some survivors recalled individual Soviet officers who intervened, protecting them from attacks. One woman from Silesia remembered a Russian captain who stood guard at her home, refusing to let other soldiers enter. He said he had a daughter my age, she recalled. Perhaps that saved me. Such stories, though rare, reveal that even in an ocean of cruelty, moments of humanity flickered. But these moments did little to erase the scale of suffering. The long shadow. The war had ended, but the assaults left scars that shaped lives for decades. Survivors carried lifelong trauma, often untreated. Children of assault grew up with unanswered questions, some only discovering the truth of their origins late in life. Silence within families created a generational wound, passed down as shame and secrecy. The assaults were not just a wartime event. They became part of Germany's social fabric, an invisible shadow across the nation's recovery. Breaking the silence. It wasn't until the late 20th century that survivors began to speak publicly. Books, memoirs, and documentaries began recording testimonies. The silence was broken, but too late for many who had carried their suffering to the grave. Historians now recognize these atrocities as among the most widespread acts of sexual violence in history. The story, long buried, is now part of the broader understanding of World War II's devastation. A bitter paradox. For Germany, the end of the war was both liberation and catastrophe. The fall of the Nazis meant the end of one of history's greatest tyrannies. Yet for millions of women, liberation came hand in hand with personal devastation. The paradox remains bitter. Germany was freed, but its women were not. Generations of silence, children, trauma, and memory. Children of violence. One of the most hidden consequences of the mass assaults of 1945 was the birth of thousands of children. Many women, unable to access abortions or too afraid to seek help, carried pregnancies to term. Some of these children grew up never knowing their fathers. Others were told lies, that their father had died in the war or disappeared. Many sensed they were different through whispered gossip, a mother's silence, or a strange absence in family photos. For the mothers, raising such children was complex. Every smile, every milestone could be a reminder of the violence that created them. Some mothers grew distant, unable to reconcile love for the child with hatred for the circumstances. Others embraced their children fiercely, determined to give them a better life despite everything. These children, now adults, have described growing up in an atmosphere of secrecy. They were Germany's unspoken generation, marked by a past no one wanted to acknowledge. Trauma without a name. Today we speak of post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. But in 1945, such concepts barely existed. Women returned from assaults with nightmares, depression, and uncontrollable fear, yet doctors often dismissed them as hysteria. Emotional suffering was rarely treated seriously. Survivors learned to hide their pain, managing it through silence and sheer endurance. Psychologists later recognized a pattern. Women avoided places that reminded them of the assaults. Many suffered flashbacks when they heard Russian being spoken. Sudden noises, boots, shouts, or doors slamming could trigger panic. But because the trauma was never named or validated, it remained a private torment, silently passed down within families. Families under strain. The war had already left families fractured. Millions of German men were dead, imprisoned, or missing. Survivors of the assaults often had to carry the household alone, working, raising children, and rebuilding homes in the rubble. Marriages also suffered. Husbands who returned from prisoner-of-war camps often could not accept what had happened to their wives. Some reacted with anger, accusing their wives of infidelity, as if the assaults had been a choice. Others withdrew emotionally, unable to face the reality of their wives' suffering. The unspoken pain became a wedge between couples, creating coldness where once there had been closeness. Shame and silence as inheritance. Children born in the late 1940s and 1950s often describe a heavy silence in their homes. Their mothers rarely spoke of the war, and when they did, it was usually about hunger, bombings, or loss, not about the assaults. But silence itself can be an inheritance. Children sense the pain, the shame, the unresolved grief. Many grew up with a vague but powerful understanding that something terrible had happened, something no one dared to explain. Psychologists call this transgenerational trauma, pain passed down not through words but through behavior, silence, and atmosphere. It shaped the way families related to each other, long after the war ended. A divided memory, East and West. How the story was remembered, or suppressed, also depended on where survivors lived after the war. East Germany, GDR, Under Soviet influence, the Red Army was portrayed as liberators. Public acknowledgement of mass assaults was impossible. Women who spoke out risked punishment. The official narrative left no room for their suffering. West Germany, FRG. The new federal republic focused on rebuilding and confronting the crimes of Nazism. Talking about German civilian suffering was seen as inappropriate or even revisionist. The world wanted Germany to repent, not to claim victimhood. This divide created another layer of silence. In both East and West, survivors were effectively trapped. One side silenced them by censorship, the other by shame. The role of literature. It was not until writers and intellectuals began addressing the issue that the silence cracked. One of the most famous works was A Woman in Berlin, an anonymous diary published in the 1950s. It recounted, in raw detail, the experiences of one Berlin woman during the Soviet invasion. The book shocked readers. Some condemned it for dishonoring German women, while others praised it for finally breaking the silence. Decades later, historians confirmed its authenticity, and it became a key testimony of those months. Through such works, survivors' voices began slowly, painfully, to enter the public record. Confronting the numbers. Historians have struggled to calculate the true scale of the assaults. Estimates range from 1.4 to 2 million women across Germany and Eastern Europe. In Berlin alone, up to 100,000 cases may have occurred in just a few weeks. The statistics are staggering, but they also risk reducing human suffering to numbers. Each figure represents a life disrupted, a family scarred, a memory carried in silence. Survivors often resented the coldness of statistics, preferring their stories to be heard as lived experiences rather than abstract data. The hidden men. The story is often told through women, but men too were victims. In the chaos of 1945, cases of sexual violence against men, though far less frequently recorded, did occur. Prisoners of war, teenage boys, and even elderly men were sometimes assaulted by soldiers. These stories, even more taboo than those of women, almost never surfaced publicly. But modern research has uncovered testimonies that broaden the scope of this tragedy. Religion and the search for meaning. Some survivors turned to religion to cope. Churches, though damaged and weakened, became places where women sought comfort. Yet even here, silence often prevailed. Priests and pastors, embarrassed or uncertain, sometimes avoided the subject altogether. Others abandoned faith, unable to reconcile their suffering with belief in a just God. For them, the war was not only a collapse of nation, but of faith itself. Seeds of long-term change. Ironically, while silence dominated the immediate decades, the suffering of 1945 planted seeds for change. Feminist movements of the 1970s began reclaiming the stories of women. Historians pushed to document not only the crimes of Nazism, but also the broader human cost of war. Survivors' testimonies became central to understanding how war reshapes societies, not just battlefields. In this sense, the women who carried their suffering in silence also carried history forward. Their endurance created space for later generations to tell the truth. A legacy not forgotten. Today, the story of the assaults is recognized as one of the largest acts of sexual violence in recorded history. Museums, documentaries, and history books now include the testimonies once silenced. Yet the legacy lives on in families. Descendants still wrestle with questions, with inherited trauma, with the ghosts of silence. The women of 1945 did not only endure war, they carried its consequences into the fabric of German life for generations, remembering and reckoning, breaking the silence of 1945. From silence to testimony. For decades, the story of the mass assaults in 1945 lived in shadows. Survivors carried their pain privately, families whispered, and society looked away. But silence cannot last forever. By the 1990s, after the fall of the Berlin Wall, archives began opening, and new generations of historians sought out the truth. Survivors, now elderly, finally began to speak more freely. Their testimonies were heartbreaking, but they revealed what statistics never could: the human voice of suffering. One woman, interviewed late in life, said, "I thought I would die with this secret, but I cannot. People must know what we went through, even if it is uncomfortable." Her courage echoed countless others who, at last, let their stories be told. The role of a woman in Berlin. One of the most pivotal moments in reclaiming this history came from the publication of the anonymous diary, A Woman in Berlin. First published in 1954, it was largely dismissed in Germany at the time. Only decades later, when republished in 2003, did it gain the recognition it deserved. The diary, raw and unflinching, described daily survival in a city where assault was constant and inescapable. It became a cornerstone of historical memory, forcing readers to face what survivors had endured. Historians confront the truth. Walter Zapatoxny Jr., among others, documented the scope of the tragedy, describing it as the largest mass rape event in recorded history. His work, alongside other scholars, established that between 1.4 and 2 million women were assaulted across Germany and Eastern Europe. This wasn't just Berlin. It was Silesia, Pomerania, East Prussia, towns and villages reduced not only to rubble but to places of horror. Historians stress that these atrocities were not simply acts of individual cruelty, but part of the broader collapse of moral order in war. When soldiers are dehumanized, when civilians are painted as enemies, and when chaos reigns, atrocities multiply. Global awareness. It wasn't until international documentaries, books, and museum exhibitions began addressing the subject that global awareness grew. For decades, the world's image of World War II was shaped by the fight against Nazism, the Holocaust, and the liberation of Europe. These are vital stories, but they left little room for acknowledging German suffering, especially suffering at the hands of the Allies. By the early 2000s, however, conversations began to shift. The reality of mass sexual violence in war, whether in Germany, Bosnia, Rwanda, or elsewhere, became part of global human rights discussions. The women of 1945 were finally recognized as part of a much larger pattern: civilians, especially women, paying the highest price in conflict. Survivors speak for the future. Survivors who came forward often said they didn't speak for themselves, but for the future. They wanted their stories to be warnings. They knew war would come again somewhere, sometime, and they hoped that by telling their truths, future generations would act to protect women, children, and civilians. In their testimonies, they often asked one haunting question: will the world ever learn? Lessons of 1945. From the ashes of that spring, several lessons emerge. War's violence goes beyond the battlefield. The assaults show that wars are not just fought with bombs and bullets. They invade bodies, homes, and the most intimate corners of life. Silence protects the perpetrators. For decades, the refusal to acknowledge these crimes shielded the guilty and deepened the pain of survivors. Speaking out is essential for justice and healing. History is complicated. The Red Army were liberators who helped defeat Hitler, but they were also perpetrators of atrocities. Recognizing both truths is part of mature historical reckoning. Survivors' voices matter. Statistics are cold. Stories breathe humanity back into history. Listening to survivors transforms numbers into names, experiences, and empathy. Modern reckoning. Today, memorials and historical research finally acknowledge the women of 1945. Scholars teach the subject in universities, and museums include exhibits on civilian suffering during the war. Yet the reckoning is incomplete. Many descendants still live with unanswered questions, family secrets, and inherited trauma. Survivors themselves, most of whom have now passed, never saw full justice or recognition. But in remembering them, in telling their stories now, we honor their endurance. Closing reflection. In the end, the story of the mass assaults in Germany in 1945 is not just a German story. It is a human story. It is a warning of what happens when war strips away humanity, when vengeance is unleashed, when silence is enforced. It is also a testament to survival. The women who endured, who rebuilt, who raised families in the shadow of trauma, and who carried history forward even when the world refused to listen. Their voices, though long suppressed, now echo, and they remind us of one truth that transcends time. War does not end when the guns fall silent. For civilians, its scars can last for generations.